Attention will please be in order. My fellow Americans, we are back to name the next President of the United States.
There is no law that says that it has to be this way, but it has always been so, and it probably always will be.
I come here to announce that I am a candidate for the presidency of the United States. I stand before you without a single pledge or promise or understanding of any kind, except for the advancement of your cause and the preservation of American democracy.
The burdens of the presidency stagger the imagination. Its power for good or evil smothers exultation, and it converts vanity to prayer.
The process of electing a president of the United States had to be invented. There was no realistic, effective machinery devised by the Constitution, and the office itself was without precedent. The early Americans simply had to improvise, or there would have been no executive at all. There is no purpose now in asking whether they perform their duties well or ill. The alternatives have long since disappeared. What is significant is that in the early youth of the Republic, certain American men, humorless New Englanders seasoned by Puritan ethics and 2 long winters, big city opportunists newly arrived and hungry for spoils, land-rich aristocrats secure in their dignity and suspicious of all who are not, drinkers and non-drinkers, honest men and knaves, thinkers, doers, hangers-on, soldiers, farmers, men who chewed tobacco and built houses and learned to read, all met in convention assembled, and slowly and painfully, and in response to the demands of their time and place, worked out a system for electing a president of the United States. Others have copied it, but surely nowhere else does it have quite the flavor and folk charm that it does here in the country where it was born.
Mr. Chairman, I call for a roll of the delegation.
Will the gentleman who has requested that the delegation be polled give his name to the chair?
My name is Romani, R-O-M-A-N-Y. I request that the name of the alternate be called.
The secretary will call the name of the alternate.
It's all right, he's not here.
Lord, give us Mr. Roosevelt again. He knows that where the coyotes howl and the wind sports free, we'll bury them there on the lone prairie.
General Washington was elected the first president because it was simply inconceivable that anyone else could do the job as well. His successors, from John Adams through Andrew Jackson, were selected as candidates by a caucus of party leaders in Congress. It wasn't until 1831, December 12th, 1831, that about 160 national Republicans, a restless coalition that accepted anyone who was against Jackson, met in the Athenaeum building in Baltimore and nominated a man they hoped would become president. It was the first real national convention, and the pattern began to evolve. They made speeches and passed resolutions, and to show their patriotism, invited the aging Charles Carroll, signer of the Declaration of Independence, to attend their deliberations. Mr. Carroll declined the invitation, pointing out that the December weather was inclement. So they went about their business and nominated their candidate, the Honorable Henry Clay of Kentucky. Wait a moment, gentlemen. He lost. Names well remembered and not so well remembered. Martin Van Buren, Millard Fillmore of New York, James Polk and Zachary Taylor, and Mr. Lincoln of Illinois. We have never heard their voices, and we never will. Lincoln probably said jine for join, crick for creek, and those who remembered said his voice was surprisingly high. We'll never know, but we can reach back. In 1896, the Democrats held their convention in the Coliseum in Chicago. It was July and hot. The Republicans had met in June and nominated William McKinley, an amiable man from Ohio. They had also come out for a coinage based on gold. The Democrats weren't so sure. They hated to lose the mining states, but they needed a voice to make it all clear. And the spokesman was there, William Jennings Bryan from Nebraska. He was young, 36. He had not been mentioned as a candidate. But after a rousing speech in favor of free coinage of silver, he was nominated on the 5th ballot. Years later, after 3 futile attempts to win the presidency, when he was old and defeat walked with him like an old friend, he repeated that speech into one of Mr. Edison's remarkable machines. For a moment, the old excitement and the drama and all the faces and sounds came back to him.
You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
American politics was dominated from the turn of the century to the First World War by 2 men, Bryan and a New Yorker whom a disgruntled politician always called that damned cowboy, Theodore Roosevelt. After 2 terms as president, Roosevelt turned the job over to William Howard Taft and went to Africa to hunt lions. By 1912, he had returned, and he wanted his old job back. Taft and a substantial number of Republican Party leaders wanted him to go back to Africa, and they refused him the nomination. Roosevelt acted characteristically. He proclaimed that he felt like a bull moose, a reference that was not entirely clear, and he organized his own party, the Bull Moose, or technically the Progressive Party. And one day, head thrown back and his famous eyeglasses flashing with light, he defined the new party.
I feel that the Progressive Party should appeal peculiarly to the young men and therefore to the boys who are to be the next generation of voters. The principles for which we stand are the principles of fair play and a square deal for every man and every woman in the United States. A square deal politically, a square deal in matters social and industrial. I wish to see you boys join the Progressive Party and act in that party and as good citizens in the same way I'd expect any one of you to act in a football game. In other words, don't flinch, don't foul, and hit the line hard.
He lost. A Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, an austere intellectual who had been president of Princeton University, became president of the United States. Wilson had precise ideas about running a country as he had precise ideas about running a college, but he was not given time. There was an untidy situation developing, and he had to attend first to that. In August 1914, in the second year of Wilson's presidency, a number of deep-seated rivalries that had been smoldering in Europe since the Franco-Prussian War and before broke out in active fighting.
It's a long way to Tipperary. It's It's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know.
Wilson kept us out and was re-elected in 1916 for his adroitness in keeping our forces over here. But events were too big for him. A vessel with Americans aboard torpedoed and sunk off Ireland, hints of Germans in Mexico, and in April 1917, the American Expeditionary Force was formed, and we were in.
Over there, send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drums come coming everywhere.
American forces were under the command of a handsome, tight-lipped soldier named John Pershing. He was not famous for exuberance, nor was he given to prolonged speech. Even his famous Lafayette, we are here, is strongly suspect. But we have his voice, his words spoken when the Hun was still at the outskirts of Paris, and every flickering light off the American coast was thought to be the onset of a Boche invasion.
3,000 miles from home, an American army is fighting for you. Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake. Only the hardest blows can win against the enemy we are fighting.
Give my regards to Broadway. Remember me to Herald Square. Tell all the gang at 42nd Street that I will soon be there.
It was the last war but one where we could afford to be sentimental. Mr. Wilson, almost alone, was not sentimental. When it was over, he went to Paris and, dreaming an impossible dream, tried to write a piece that would last for all time. And he wanted something more, a League of Nations, a Congress of Man. It would be meaningful, of course, only if this country became a member. To that end, Mr. Wilson spoke across the country.
It is in the broad light of this new day that we stand face to face with great questions of right and of justice. What is there to do? There are two great things to do. One is to set up the rule of justice and of right. The other thing, the additional duty, is the great task of protecting our people and our resources.
There were others who would have no part of this. The most powerful and the most articulate was a tall, aristocratic senator from Massachusetts, Henry Cabot Lodge. American participation in a League of Nations? The Honorable Mr. Lodge demurred.
I must think of the United States first. And when I think of the United States first, in an arrangement like this, I am thinking of what is best for the world. Internationalism is to me repulsive.
We did not join, and Wilson died. In 1920, the Republicans met in Chicago and nominated Warren Harding of Ohio, a man of whom one contemporary said he was determinedly mediocre. The League of Nations ceased to be an issue, and Mr. Harding went on record as being against war.
I find 100,000 sorrows touching my heart. It must not be again. It must not be again.
Suddenly, it seemed, we were in a new era. It has been called, for want of a better term, the Roaring Twenties. There was a depression after the war, but it didn't last long. It was as though a whole generation was suddenly impatient to cast off old things and get ready for the future. There was Henry Ford and his Model T. You could have one in any color as long as it was black. There was bobbed hair and Babe Ruth. A lot of people paid $1 million to see a prize fight, and some women were smoking cigarettes. The selling of spirits, wine, or beer was illegal, and there were a lot of people who felt very strongly about this. One of them was Billy Sunday. He was an evangelist and no mincer of words.
The return of the saloon would mean the overthrow of civilization in our land. It was because I didn't want our boys to die drunkards that I fought and fight. I'm going to live long enough to see America so dry, you'll have to prime a man before he can spit. And I'll fight the saloon from Hawaii to Hoboken. And I'll kick it as long as I've got a foot. And I'll punch it as long as I have a fist. I'll butt it as long as I have a head. I'll bite it as long as I have a tooth. And when I'm old and fistless and footless and toothless, I'll gum it till I go home to glory and it goes home to perdition.
Perhaps the most famous single individual in an era of famous people was a movie actor. Rudolph Valentino was Italian, but frequently portrayed an Arab, which gave him a chance to ride across the desert on a white horse and capture English girls and take them to his tent, where he made love to them, mainly by widening his eyes and staring at them sternly, which in the 1920s apparently indicated uncontrollable passion. His movies were made before talking pictures, but he did record a song, and the disc has lasted longer than his charm. Calvin Coolidge, a taciturn New Englander who became president on Harding's death, was in charge of the country during a large part of these goings-on. It was during his presidency that a young man named Charles Lindbergh took off from Long Island in a fragile single-motored airplane and alone flew non-stop to Paris. It was one of the few incidents of that decade that gave the country an excuse to be proud. On Lindbergh's return, President Coolidge assembled a number of notables in the Natural Amphitheater at the Washington Monument and presented the newly made colonel with the Distinguished Flying Cross.
As President of the United States, I bestow the Distinguished Flying Cross as a symbol of appreciation for what he is and what he has done upon Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh.
For the most part, the period was one of wry acknowledgement that the times were out of joint. Will Rogers addressed a group of bankers.
Loan sharks and interest hounds. I have addressed every form of organized graft in the United States, excepting Congress. I understand you have 10,000 here, and with what you have in the various federal prisons brings your membership up to around 30,000.
In August of 1927, Mr. Coolidge announced that he did not choose to run in 1928. Herbert Hoover was nominated by the Republicans, and the Democrats took a flyer. They nominated a New Yorker, a Tammany man who had become governor. His name was Alfred E. Smith.
This country has been so well blessed, so rich not only in its past and its present, but in its future. Well may we say as we travel about this continent that this is the greatest of all lands. This is the most glorious one in all the world.
Mr. Hoover was basically against federal regimentation. It was a concept he would keep all his life.
Planned industry and planned farming and planned credit and planned currency and planned attack upon the Constitution. I might suggest two more. There are planned deficits and planned politics.
Hoover won. The fact of Smith's Catholicism was vital in the campaign, although Hoover himself did not accept it as an issue. A year later, there was another issue that he did accept. The whole country had to. It was the economy. Something went wrong. There was a depression.
If the market takes another slump, I know thousands and thousands of married men who will have to leave their sweethearts and go back to their wives. Nowadays, when a man walks into a hotel and requests a room on the 19th floor, the clerk asks him for sleeping or jumping.
Eddie Cantor was right, but a change was coming. summer 1932, the Republicans renominated Herbert Hoover. The Democrats, meeting at the Chicago Stadium, had two real candidates, New York's Governor Franklin Roosevelt and former Governor Al Smith. The balloting began at 3 a.m. The key number for a two-thirds vote was 769. On the first ballot, Roosevelt had 666 votes, Smith 201. By 9:15, they were still deadlocked, although Roosevelt was gaining. The next day, California switched, and the end was clear. Franklin Roosevelt of New York. In the election, Roosevelt won a devastating victory over Hoover, 472 electoral votes to 59. There was a new president, a new phrase, the New Deal, and a new era, the era of the forgotten man.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
An American male now in his late 40s or older has experienced in his lifetime a depression, a huge 4-year war and several shorter ones, the advent of the atomic age, and a period of unprecedented social dissent. For many, the most dramatic of these periods was oddly enough the Great Depression. Simply stated, it was a time when many Americans just did not have enough money, not enough to pay the mortgage, not enough sometimes to eat.
I believe that nearly all Americans are sensible and calm people. We do not get greatly excited, nor is our peace of mind disturbed, whether we be businessmen or workers or farmers.
Through it all, the apple sellers on Fifth Avenue, the long lineups for menial jobs, WPA and NRA, there was a voice that seemed to be ever present.
We are not frightened by reactionary lawyers or by political editors.
His first term was only months old when the opposition began to develop. One of those opposed was Huey Long, senator from Louisiana.
Mr. Roosevelt has had his way. He's one man that can't blame any of his troubles on Huey Long. He's had his way. Back down in my part of the country, if any man has the measles, he blames that on me. But there's one man that can't blame anything on anybody but himself, and that's Mr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
These Republican leaders have not been content with attacks on me, or on my wife, or on my sons. No, not content with that. They now include my little dog, Fallon. Well, of course, I don't resent attacks, and my family don't resent attacks, but Fallon does resent them.
The election year 1936 gave opponents of Roosevelt their first chance to clear up, as they said, the mess in Washington. They chose as their candidate Alf Landon of Kansas. His supporters wore sunflowers, the Kansas flower, and looked to Landon as the one man who could end the whole bad dream. He was ready, willing, and able.
Ladies and gentlemen, I accept the nomination of the Republican Party for the presidency of the United States.
It was quite a campaign. Al Smith, whose ties with the Democratic Party went back to Tammany's Big Tim Sullivan and turn-of-the-century speeches about how the Republican Party was always the party of the rich and selfish, Smith himself became a Republican. It was probably simply because he resented Roosevelt being the candidate when he thought he should have been.
Order, please. Order, please. Remember, we're losing time on the radio.
It was certainly the political paradox of the century, and Mr. Smith wore his new republicanism like an ill-fitting suit.
Listen to me for a minute. Have you followed this campaign? Have you listened on the radio? Or have you read the speeches? If you have, tell me when you heard the candidate on the Democratic ticket speak about the Democratic platform. Never. I'll tell you what it is. It's we and I and the administration and the New Deal.
It was a landslide for Roosevelt. Landon carried only 2 states, Maine and Vermont. But the governor acknowledged his defeat with grace and charm.
You've all heard the story of the Kansas tornado leaving nothing behind. The wife came to find her husband laughing. He asked him, "What are you laughing at, you old fool?" He replied, "The completeness of it."
The big rambling house at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue was to be Democratic for another 4 years. In 1940, Wendell Willkie gave Roosevelt the run of his life. He was not a professional politician. He had not held office. But he was sincere and convincing. And when he spoke, people listened.
I stand before you without a single pledge or promise or understanding of any kind except for the advancement of your cause and the preservation of American democracy.
But it was 1940, and in 1940 it didn't make much difference what anybody said. Events were louder than any words that could be spoken. There was Hitler on the Channel coast of France doing an exuberant little dance because he was that close to England. Just a few short miles across the water, and almost all of Europe would be his. Here in America, we watched. Japan was in China, Italy joined the Germans, and inevitably, one Sunday afternoon, we too were very much a part of it.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition, and we'll all stay free.
It is a measure of strength, not weakness, that in the midst of war we can afford a campaign to determine whether or not we should change horses. In 1944, Governor Thomas E. Dewey of New York felt strongly that we should.
I'm happy to be able to say to you that I come to you unfettered by a single obligation or promise to any living person.
Roosevelt won again, an unprecedented 4th term. But there is a price for every victory, and a time was coming for a settling up. Suddenly, it seemed, the once strong voice was no longer strong, and we knew, as he must have known, that the end was near.
I hope that you will pardon me for an unusual posture of sitting down during the presentation of what I want to say, but I know that you will realize that it makes it a lot easier for me, but also because of the fact that I have just completed a 14,000-mile trip.
And we had a new president, Harry S. Truman, former senator from Missouri. Not a new type in American politics, but new to his generation. He played poker and got mad sometimes, and probably knew American history better than any man, save Wilson, who ever served as president. And when he campaigned, he brought back into politics the old ways. He campaigned like Andy Jackson, whose descendant, politically, he was.
Let's take a look at the record of the 80th Congress they're so proud of. I call it the notorious do-nothing Republican 80th Congress. Maybe I ought to leave out the do-nothing part of it, because it did do some things, most of them bad.
The Republicans that year, 1948, again picked Thomas Dewey. It looked to most like a shoo-in for Dewey. Election night, 1948.
What you've got to remember is that since these big city returns come in earlier than the country returns, and since traditionally the big cities are more democratic than the country, these total figures are not conclusive. On a percentage basis,
millions of Americans heard Mr. Kaltenborn that night. One of those who heard was Mr. Truman.
Mr. Kaltenborn was saying, while the president is 1 million votes ahead in the popular vote, and we are very sure that when the country vote comes in, Mr. Truman will be defeated by an overwhelming majority.
There was the Truman Doctrine, the Berlin Blockade, war in Korea, the Marshall Plan to keep Western Europe from falling into its own ashes, Chambers and Hiss, and then, unexpectedly, this inserted into a routine speech.
I've tried my best to give the nation everything I had in me. And I always quote one epitaph, which is on a tombstone in the cemetery at Tombstone, Arizona. And it said, "Here lies Jack Williams. He done his damnedest."
Again, as in every 4 years since Washington stepped down, the race was on. This time it was both parties who needed to find a candidate. There were several, among them Governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois.
I found this letter on my desk just before I left Springfield, Illinois this afternoon. Honorable Governor Stevenson, sir, you should marry Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, and you should run for the presidential nomination.
The Republicans basically had two candidates. Robert Taft of Ohio was the expected choice, but there were a lot of Republicans who were looking eastward across the Atlantic to General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
There isn't the slightest evidence that General Eisenhower could possibly be a strong candidate or could conduct the kind of campaign that ought to be conducted if we're going to win this election.
The Republican convention met on July 7th, 1952 at the Amphitheater in Chicago. Both Taft and Eisenhower wanted the nomination. Both had strong and loyal support.
I present to you tonight for your prayerful and earnest consideration Mr. Integrity, Mr. Republican, Mr. American. I present my friend Bob Taft.
It is with pride that I place before this convention for President of the United States the name of Dwight David Eisenhower.
On the first ballot, Eisenhower got 595 votes, only 9 short of nomination. Taft had 500, but he couldn't hold them. Senator Thigh went to the floor microphone and announced that Minnesota wished to change its vote to Eisenhower. John Bricker of Ohio, a Taft man, came to the rostrum and asked that the vote be made unanimous.
I want to congratulate General Eisenhower on his nomination and say that I will do everything possible to assist him in the campaign to secure his election and in his administration when he is elected president.
Later in that same month, the Democrats took over the same amphitheater. Stevenson or Kefauver? It was Stevenson.
And now, my friends, that you have made your decision, I will fight to win that office with all my heart and my soul.
And one of the strangest campaigns in modern times began. Eisenhower, the non-politician, learned fast. Stevenson, a professional politician, was reserved, subtle, sometimes inspiring, and sometimes funny.
A letter from a California lady who knew my parents when they lived here 50 years ago. She writes that after Grover Cleveland was nominated for the presidency in 1892, and my own grandfather was nominated for vice president, she named her two kittens Grover Cleveland and Adlai Stevenson. Grover, she writes me, couldn't stand the excitement of the campaign and died before the election. But Adlai lived to be a very old cat.
It would be very, very fine if one could command new and amusing language, witticisms, to bring you a chuckle. Frankly, I have no intention of trying to do so.
We have already come so far that we can never return to the time when in the presence of mountains of wheat there was little bread, when the splendid American dream seemed at a shabby end, and the splendid promises of American life were ashes in the mouths of the people.
Now, where will a new administration begin? It will begin with its president taking a firm, simple resolution. That resolution will be to forego the diversions of politics and to concentrate on the job of ending the Korean War until that job is honorably done. That job requires a personal trip to Korea. Only in that way could I learn how best to serve the American people in the cause of peace. I shall go to Korea.
Eisenhower won an overwhelming victory. The popular vote was 33,936,000 for Eisenhower to 27,314,000 for Stevenson. In the Electoral College, Eisenhower's victory was 442 to 89.
Someone asked me as I came in down on the street how I felt. And I was reminded of a story that a fellow townsman of ours used to tell, Abraham Lincoln. And they asked him how he felt once after an unsuccessful election. He said he felt like a little boy who had stubbed his toe in the dark. That he was too old to cry, but it hurt too much to laugh.
In 1956, the two men contested again. Eisenhower's victory was even greater the second time. Mr. Stevenson's comment, "A funny thing happened on the way to the White House." That year, 1956, a new name was entered on the Democratic rolls. The young senator from Massachusetts made a bid for the vice presidential nomination. His name was John F. Kennedy. He was rich, handsome, very determined, and he was a Catholic. He lost, but he did try again. In 1960, he won the Democratic presidential nomination. His Republican opponent was the former Vice President Richard Nixon.
We have faith in the people, and because our programs for progress are based on that faith, we shall succeed where our opponents will fail in building the better America that I've described.
We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, the frontier of unfilled hopes and unfilled threats. The new frontier of which I speak is not a set of promises. It is a set of challenges. It sums up not what I intend to offer to the American people, but what I intend to ask of them.
Kennedy won in a photo finish. His inaugural was one of the best of such ceremonies in a long time. Robert Frost, aging and bundled against the brisk winds that blew down Pennsylvania Avenue, read some poetry. Then the new president spoke.
We observe today not a victory of party, but a celebration of freedom, symbolizing an end as well as a beginning, signifying renewal as well as change. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
He was allowed 3 years, and there is no way of assessing how our lives were changed by those 3 fast shots in Dallas. The might-have-beens were irretrievably canceled out. But even in change, there is continuity. In 1964, the vice president, now president, like Truman and others before him, decided to make it on his own.
Flash that smile, Lyndon. Show us that winning style, Lyndon. Promise you'll stay with us in 64.
Our problems are many and are great, but our opportunities are even greater. And let me make this clear. I ask the American people for a mandate not to preside over a finished program, not just to keep things going. I ask the American people for a mandate to begin.
Part of our tradition is that the newly nominated candidate for president can, if he wishes, select his running mate. Johnson so wished.
I hope that you will choose as the next Vice President of the United States my close, my long time, my trusted colleague, Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota.
For the Republicans, a choice between a liberal, Nelson Rockefeller of New York, and a conservative, Barry Goldwater of Arizona. To those who heard Rockefeller at the convention, there was little doubt how it would go.
During this year, I have crisscrossed this nation, fighting for these principles, fighting to keep the Republican Party, fighting to keep the Republican Party the party of all the people, and warning of the extremist threat, its danger to the party, you don't control the audience. I got 5 minutes worth. You control the audience, and I'll make mine 5 minutes. The governor is entitled to be heard for 5 minutes. Right. Now, he can't be heard for 5 minutes if we're going to have these constant interruptions. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is still a free country, ladies and gentlemen.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. Most Democrats and Republicans in the Senate voted for an $11.5 billion tax cut for American citizens and American business, but not Senator Goldwater. Most Democrats and Republicans in the Senate voted for the National Defense Education Act, but not the temporary. And my fellow Americans, most Democrats and most Republicans in the Senate voted to help the United Nations in its peacekeeping functions when it was in financial difficulty, but not Senator Goldwater.
That was 4 years ago, and once more it is time to try again. It is always time to try again, and so it should be. If we've learned one thing across almost 2 centuries of talk and cheers and confusion and wheeling and dealing and speeches, good and bad, and all the tumult and the shouting, it is that there's always a chance that next time things will be different. And there, surely, is our glory. Presidents are good or not so good, true or faltering, but the office of the presidency survives. We find a kind of wisdom in the seemingly senseless sound and fury, and we find power in the collective wisdom of many people saying many things. No other country has done it better. Perhaps this is our contribution to the world. The office of the presidency of the United States. It has survived, unchanged, all the conventions and all the speeches. It is almost as though each man who comes to it is made one with those who have gone before.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.